Have you pressed record, Sarah?
Are we recording? Are we live?
We are recording. We are recording. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to start the webinar. Okay, there we go. So welcome everybody to the third webinar from Operation Diversity. My name's Sarah Chapman. I'm the Managing Director and I launched Operation Diversity a couple of years ago, and we've just started doing these webinars to raise awareness of dyslexia and other overlapping specific learning differences, and generally just to share good practice. It's about empowering children, parents, educators and employers. So I hope you find the webinar useful, and tell your friends and colleagues about our webinars. Maybe they'd like to participate in one in the future. The webinar tonight is a repeat of the webinar that we did last week that went extremely well. So thank you, Joe and Karen, for your contribution last week. The webinar titled Unravelling the Mystery of Diagnostic Assessments and Reports. So we have Joe Rees and Karen Pollard-Rylance, who are two specialist dyslexia assessors who work closely with Operation Diversity, and they've helped a lot of our families. So I will go across to Jo and she can introduce herself to you, and then we'll follow on with Karen.
Okay, hi everyone. I always think when you're listening to somebody present that it's always quite useful to kind of know a bit about that person and kind of where they come from. So my background is I'm a primary school teacher. I worked in primary school for about 14 years as a classroom teacher and as a Senko. I've always been passionate about inclusion and kind of making a difference. I was a bit like a magnet to kids with SEN. I kind of always kind of sought them out in my class. For a couple of years, I ran a specialist dyslexic provision and did all of my specialist dyslexic qualifications. I'm an associate member of the British Dyslexic Association. I'm a mum of 3 children, aged between 12 and 7, 2 of which are definitely dyslexic, which is all good. I wear my heart on my sleeve. I'm very passionate, which sometimes gets me into quite a lot of trouble, but you know, we need to say it how it is. I like to put the possible into impossible. Love nothing more than a new challenge. I came across Operation Diversity a couple of years ago when I started blogging about dyslexia, because I'm actually dyslexic myself. So I sort of started blogging about parenting a dyslexic, kind of being dyslexic, but also being a specialist dyslexic assessor. So that's how I came across Sarah and Operation Diversity. I'm a lifelong learner, always keen to kind of try something new and learn something new. And I set up my company Another Way Round, and that's the logo there, about 15 months ago, because I kind of am passionate about making a difference. The company offers training. It's based on the Isle of Wight, but I go sort of all around the south, kind of around Hampshire as well. Southampton, I've done a bit in Portsmouth. And the company offers training, specialist assessment and tuition, and support to families as well. But I believe that if you're going to be a really good teacher, you have to continue to learn something new. So if Sarah puts the next couple of pictures up, there's a picture there of me. Actually, last year I ran the Brighton Marathon. Never run a race before in my life, but last year my challenge was I taught myself to run a marathon, and I'm upside down because that's just me, really. I'm a little bit different. Over to you, Karen.
Okay, thank you. Right, so similarly to Joe, I put teaching at the heart of everything that I do. I have been a teacher, not in primary education to start off with, but in further and higher education since 1998. I moved really into additional learning support from the year 2000. So teaching learners with lots of different diverse backgrounds, coordinating their support packages was something that I really enjoyed doing. And I suppose what I have always been involved in, as with Joe, is inclusion and making sure that people are included no matter what. So acceptance of difference, I suppose, working with diverse learners across the whole range of specific learning differences. And I think my ethos is very much to say that looking at the strengths, really, you don't have to suffer from a learning difference. We try to empower people as much as possible. So that's me. I'm an educator, I'm an empowerer, I'm a facilitator. I work a lot with primary learners now. About 12 months ago, I decided that my private business was taking off and I was enjoying it so much that I wanted to put more energies into that. So I built my consultancy and assessment and tuition business, just promoting myself basically. So Karen Pollard-Rylance. I attained my master's in specific learning differences in 2014, and really that has made me focus a little bit more on neuroscience. So my logo you can see just under my face on my picture on the left hand side of the screen there, with the question mark in the brain, because I always find, for me, that's what's fascinating, finding out what's going on in people's brains and what makes people that little bit different. And the strengths. So I always focus on strengths. And I'm a huge advocate of multisensory learning. With my assessments, I also am an associate member of the British Dyslexia Association, so I have AMDA status. So I totally focus on quality. Quality is a really big part of my ethos, and what I find so much more now that I enjoy the empowerment of working with the student, the teacher, the parent, to enable learners to get the most out of their learning. So in working with Sarah through Operation Diversity, I have found that I've been able to connect with so many new people, and it's very, very, very exciting. The prospects of the future are brilliant. We've got a great network of people that we work with. And I am based in Lancashire, basically. I am the opposite scale to where Jo is. I'm a bit more up north. I am based in Ramsbottom, which is Bury. It's North Manchester. So I cover all the area around there, but obviously we'll branch into Cheshire, Yorkshire, and people will travel to me as much as I am happy to travel to them. I'm also an Erlen practitioner, so I do Erlen screening. So you can see there's some coloured glasses. I'm wearing coloured glasses. I have Erlen syndrome myself, and I have difficulties with visual perception problems. So that kind of encompasses a little bit about me and who I am. Okay, thank you. So, good evening to the webinar. What we aim to do this evening is to identify the quality assurance process for diagnostic assessments. We want to discuss the process of identifying dyslexia. We're going to outline the key differences between a screener and a full diagnostic report. We're going to provide a deeper understanding of what the scores actually mean within the report, explain the function of each assessment and which areas they explore, and we're going to look at what specialist assessors look for when we start to identify dyslexic profile. Okay. So we thought the first thing we'd have a look at really is the quality assurance. Now, we within Operation Diversity totally agree with following best practice. And so therefore, all the assessors within the group are qualified assessors and can be found under the SASC organisation. The SASC organisation is the SBLD Assessment Standards Committee. So in order for us to get our qualifications and to keep updating with our qualifications, we have to be registered with those people. So if anybody were to look for an assessor within their area, they could go onto the SASC website and they could find an assessor, type in an assessor's name, and it will give you the indication as to whether they are registered or not. And that is the gold standard. That is what we kind of look for to make sure. I mentioned earlier about focusing on quality, and that's something that I certainly am very passionate about. Every 3 years we have to continually update. So we personally, I work through PATOS, is my regulatory body, and also I need to update my assessment practicing certificate, as we all do, and that's on an annual basis. So it's 3-year basis, sorry. So it's almost as if it's the assessment of our assessors, if you like, making sure that we are working to the best possible standard and following that framework for consistency and quality. The continued professional development is something we do on an annual basis, and we have to make sure that we clock so many hours. Certainly 20 hours is the good norm to try and get as much additional information and updating our training, so it gives you the best possible service, if you like. So we always suggest to parents that we look for specialist assessors that are SASC registered, that have the AMDA status, which is the associate member of the British Dyslexia Association. For myself, I am PATOS registered. There are other registration bodies, but that's the one that I tend to use, and a lot of assessors do use. And with that, we have to make sure that not only are we going to give the quality in the assessment process itself, but also in the quality of the report writing. So we follow very strict guidelines to make sure that our reports are standardised and that they are able to be understood by a variety of different readers, if you think who those reports are going to be written for. So it's really important, and that's one of the things we're going to go over tonight, is how can you make sure that the report you get, you understand, and you get the most out of it, not only for yourself, but for your children. So the one thing we need to stress is that your assessor, whoever you choose to do the assessment, does have the current certification, and that is what we would suggest. Thank you.
Okay, so before we can begin to think about like actual reports, I think it's quite handy. We need to kind of look at what dyslexia actually is, I think. And if we look at the British Dyslexic Association and how they currently define dyslexia at the moment, dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty that mainly affects the development of literacy and language-related skills. It's likely to be present at birth and to be lifelong in its effects. It's characterised by difficulties with phonological processing, rapid naming, working memory, processing speed, and the automatic development of skills that may not match up to an individual's other cognitive abilities. So that's telling us that dyslexia is more than just one thing. And if we look at the definition again, I've highlighted all of the things that dyslexia actually is in a different colour. So we can see, look, it's the development of literacy and language-related skills. We've got phonological processing, rapid naming, working memory, processing speed, and the development of skills that may not match up to an individual's other cognitive abilities. So that tells us that dyslexia is more than one thing, okay? And if we think of dyslexia as a bit like a spectrum, so some of you may have heard of autism being referred to as a spectrum, kind of made up of varying amounts of different things. And dyslexia can kind of be thought of in the same way, really. And the best way I've found to explain that to you is to imagine it as a keyboard, and every note is a different colour. So we've got working memory, we've also got visual processing, we've got auditory processing, phonological awareness, phonological memory, sequencing, and verbal naming. Okay, so if we imagine that each key is a different element, if you like, of dyslexia, and everybody's tune is going to be slightly different. So it may be that you have quite a big bit of working memory and quite a bit of phonological awareness, but actually sequencing isn't an issue. Or it may be that verbal naming is a real area of difficulty, and there's only a little bit of the other things. Okay, so that's how I want us to kind of imagine dyslexia as we go through tonight. The other thing I was going to say is, so it takes more than one test to actually identify and diagnose dyslexia. And whilst profiles may be similar, no profile is ever going to be exactly the same. So if we think back to that tune on that previous slide, everybody's tune is going to be slightly different. Okay, so that's kind of what dyslexia is. So then we need to look at the steps that we're going to take to identify dyslexia. And I know through reading comments on the page that quite often you as parents, and I know myself as a parent of a child of a parent with a dyslexic child, can sometimes feel quite frustrated with school because it feels like school aren't going as quickly as we want them to go. But actually, schools have a process that they have to follow. And schools follow something called the graduated response, which is outlined in the SEN Code of Practice, which all schools have to abide by. Okay, and schools will be following a graduated response. And if we look at the diagram on the side, we can see that that's an assess, plan, do, review approach. So what that means is that schools may be looking for slow progress in literacy compared to other areas of development. And what they might do is, if literacy is causing them an area of concern, they may assess. They will hopefully have a conversation with you as the parent and also the child. They will then plan what intervention they're going to do to try and make progress. They will then do that intervention and they will then review that information. Okay, and as part of what they're looking for, hopefully they're also looking for mismatches between verbal understanding and written understanding, as well as, so we've got the Code of Practice states that schools should use a graduated response. And that means they use the plan, do, review approach. And as part of this approach, they will administer a dyslexic screening tool. So we're going to go into a bit more detail in a minute about screeners, but I think it's really important to say that the dyslexic screens absolutely have their place. They are the first step. No school is going to go straight to a full diagnostic assessment. So we would be hoping, good practice, we would be hoping that when children are referred to us or young people are referred to us for full diagnostic assessments, we would hope that part of the evidence they bring with them is a completed screen that has been acted on. I'm going to hand over to you now, Karen, to talk more about screens.
Thanks, Jo. Okay, so what is a screen? You might also know it as a screener. So what is a screener? As Jo mentioned, it is the starting process, really. We need to start somewhere. So there may be something that's been highlighted in the way in which the child or the young person, or even the adult, if we're looking at further and higher education, is going about their work. Their literacy may not reflect their general ability. It might be that there's something missing when we look at their written work as opposed to what they might say in a verbal situation. So there could be a reason, and a lot of reasons, why you might think, okay, we need to just see, is dyslexia present? So a screener is generally a general tool. That's what it is. We use it to explore where a person has strengths and difficulties. It's that starting point. It is one assessment with small subtests. It isn't lots and lots of a combination of tests. It will look at working memory, phonological awareness, and processing, verbal naming speed, and some screeners will look at reading approaches as well. But it's also very important to know that a screener does not give you a full diagnosis at all. It is that starting point. We're looking to see if that person is at risk. If that person is then at risk, then we'll think of maybe going into the next stage, which is the full diagnostic. The screener does not look at attainments in literacy and underlying ability. And that is what the next step in the process really looks at in more detail. So as with Jo mentioning through the graduated response, it is a really good to have that first part of the process. And lots of screeners do lots of different things, but what they're doing is basically finding a starting point for us as assessors, and for the individual, and for the school or the college or the university or the employer, to see whether that person needs to go that next step to diagnose a little bit more fully. Okay. So why do we do it? It's part of that graduated response, as we've just mentioned. It's that starting point. We've got to start to build that big picture. At the moment, it's a small picture, and we've got to look at it very holistically. We've got to gain that better understanding, basically. And why it is that young persons, say, is having challenges for a slower rate of progress in literacy. It's important that we dig a little bit deeper, because what we want to do is match an intervention that meets their needs. We want to make sure that any support package is there to work with whichever part of the challenge that that young person or individual has. Okay. All right then. So, dyslexia, as we've mentioned, is a specific learning difficulty that affects. Now, what you're seeing here is a part of that BDA, British Dyslexia Association, definition, but there's parts of it missing. So what we're saying is the screener isn't going to give us the full amount of information that we need. We still need to look at that development of literacy and language, and we still need to look at cognitive abilities. So in order to do a complete diagnosis, we've got to kind of put a lot of the pieces of the jigsaw together, and screeners don't do enough of that. That's why we must go on, if we need to do, if that person is found at risk, to the next step. And the next step is that full diagnosis. So we've got to be able to put the whole picture into context, if you like. Underlying ability and literacy attainment is what we really need to focus on more when we do a full diagnostic assessment. And screeners don't allow for that. What we also find, some of the problems with screeners, is that they're not standardised. So it's very difficult for us to know whether one screen is giving us the same information for that individual as another screener. So they're not always reliable. The other thing we would say is a non-specialist can actually administer them. So where I mentioned earlier about quality control, where I mentioned about us assessors ideally being SASC registered, it's not policed in the same way, if you like, a screener. So we have to sometimes look at that with caution. And it might be that that particular screener, because it's not giving us the full picture, it could say, well, actually, that person isn't at risk. They're not at risk of dyslexia. But in a way, even though it's saying that on paper, we as professionals might look and go, but there's X, Y, and Z that's saying, actually, even if it's coming out as being not dyslexic, there are still some niggles. Now, somebody who's a non-specialist who's administering these screeners might say, but on paper, that person isn't at risk. We might say, yeah, but we also know that screeners are not always that reliable. But our gut instinct is telling us, as professionals, we need to dig a little bit deeper and we need to explore a little bit more. So in gaining that fuller picture, that's where that dyslexia assessment, that diagnostic assessment comes in as the next step. But it is really important that we do have a starting point. So we're not saying not to screen. What we're saying is it's important to look at that screener with really, really intent eyes and say, okay, what's really going on with that individual? There are so many different screeners out there. There is the DST or the DAST, that's the dyslexia screening test, and the dyslexia adult screening test. I particularly use those because they're more paper-based. But there are also out in the wider world, if you like, lots of screeners who for which are used online. And there was quite a bit of information about Lucid Exact that Patos worked on. That's a professional association for teachers of specific learning differences, and they found that it wasn't particularly reliable. So as we've mentioned, some online screeners may do a job of starting at that starting beginning point that we need, but they're not always the best tool, and we need to be just very wary that if a child's just had a screener, that's not giving us all the information, and we need to probe a little bit more deeply. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with that in mind, I now want to talk to you and give you a bit more detail about what a full diagnostic assessment is actually doing. And I want us to think of a full diagnostic assessment as a triangle. Okay, Sarah, you're going to have to do lots of clicks here, I think. Okay, so the bottom of the triangle, okay, is the diagnostic assessment bit, and that's the bit that the screen does. Okay, so that looks at the working memory, visual memory, verbal memory, rapid naming, phonological awareness, speed of reading and reading fluency, verbal, visual and auditory processing, and decoding ability when reading. We are going to go into a lot more detail about what all of those things are in a minute, so that you've got a better understanding of what we're actually looking for. Okay, so the bottom part of the triangle is the diagnostic assessment that the screen does. Okay, the bit that the screen misses is the underlying ability side. So that looks at kind of our actual innate underlying ability, and it looks at three areas. It looks at our verbal ability, it looks at our non-verbal ability, and it looks at our spatial ability. Okay. And the third side of the triangle is current attainment. So we might want to look at word reading, we might want to look at word spelling, we might want to look at maths, and we might want to be looking for reading comprehension. And what we're doing as we're doing these assessments is we're building up a bit of a picture. We're trying to work out what's going on. We're trying to work out where a young person's strengths are and where a young person's difficulties are. Okay, so you can see if we've only got the diagnostic bit at the bottom of the screen, how we're missing two sides of the triangle, so therefore missing two sides of the picture. I'm going to hand back over to Karen now, who's going to talk about standardized scores.
Okay, thank you very much. So you've decided to go ahead. You've had a screener. It's given indicators of high risk. We've gone on then and we've done a full diagnostic assessment. What often we're asked is, okay, I've had the assessment and I've now got the results, and I've got the results in this lovely report in front of me, but I don't quite understand what it's telling me. So we thought, right, we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail for you and try and explain how we as assessors go about identifying dyslexia, and we use the testing that's normed, if you like, to that individual's age group. Once we've got the test in front of us, we have to put that score into some kind of information that means something to us. So we convert everything into a standardized score. So a standardized score ranges from 55 to 145. It means that the test has been administered to a large sample of children of the same age, and it provides a good indication of what score range children of that age group would achieve. That gives us as an assessor an understanding of where that child's current functioning is in that specific area, and it means that it provides a score that can be compared to other standard scores. And we're looking for mismatches. We're looking for things a little bit out of the ordinary, okay? Standard scores are collected from a series of tests, so it gives us that bigger picture of strengths and also weaknesses and challenges. So in order to do that, a good visual representation is on the right-hand side of your screen, and we use what we call the bell curve or the normal curve of distribution. And if you can see in the centre, so the blue, dark blue bit in the middle, that's really giving us where we're looking at around the average ranges. So the scores that we're looking for there, if they fell within that area, that's pretty much an average area of slightly average, low average or high average. And if we move to the left of the curve and we move down, we can see what we're doing is we're moving into below average and well below average areas. And if we go to the other extreme, to the right hand side, we'll go into the high average, the above average and the well above average areas. Now what we're expecting when we do the diagnostic basically is a range of scores. We're looking for what we class as spiky profile. We're looking for ups and downs. You know, we're looking for those peaks and troughs. We're looking for where a person is particularly strong and where a person may have particular challenges. And that's basically, in a nutshell, what the standard score is telling us. It's giving us a full profile of where we've got strengths and where we've got limitations. So if you look at the scores in the stars, if on your report you've got, say, a score of 72, we would know that that would be on towards the left side of the curve. We're looking at a below average range for that. On the high end, if you've got 121, say, that's taking you to a well above average score or an above average score. So it gives us an indication of where that person is sitting for those particular skills that we've tested. And that's really important because that starts to build that picture. And again, with background information and the information from the screener, we're putting up the holistic approach together. And we're saying, okay, so is this a dyslexic profile or is this not a dyslexic profile? It will give us lots and lots of information that we need to then put together. So I hope that's helped to kind of give you some context as to what a standardised score is and why it might be in the particular report. It should be there, clearly stated, and it should also give you a range as to what that assessor is used, whether it's a below average, an average, or a high average score, etc. There will be, within the report itself, an appendices that gives you more information about that. Okay, so here we go. In my reports, this is an excerpt from one of my reports. It shows me how I go about identifying where those standardised scores sit. So if you can see in table 1 there, and the ranges that I use are taken from the PATOS website. And I use that as a standard for all the tests that a particular administer. Now, we as individuals, assessors, can go to every single test, and each test will give us an example as to where that particular test is normed and where the standardised scores sit. But it can be very difficult to use that because there can be a little bit of difference as to where it sits. So, for instance, if you can see on the left-hand side of the table, you've got less than 69. So a standardised or a standard score of less than 69, we would know is within the well below average range. As we move up towards the top of the bell curve, if you remember that visual image from before, anything between 70 to 84 we would class as being below average. 85 to 89 we would know as low average. In the middle, that wide band of blue, the average area is 90 to 110. So that's our standard middle area, if you like, and we've got the belows and then we've got the highs. So high average is 101 to 115, above average 116 to 130, and well above average 131 to 150. So we have an indication as to where that individual is sitting within the test that we've done. And if you use the same descriptors or ranges for the entire test bank that you use, it gives us an indication as to where that person is sitting, and it's a lot easier for you to see as an individual where your child or young person is in those skill sets, as it is another professional also reading those particular reports and gleaning what we can do then to help that individual in the areas where they may be sitting in the low or the below or the well below average ranges. So I would always say that whatever report you get, please do look for this information because it will help you unravel a little bit more about what those scores mean and what it's saying for that individual. Okay, thank you. You may see percentile scores. Now, percentile scores are just another way of describing that standard score. It can be very difficult for an unprofessional eye, if you like, to look at it and go, what does this mean? Basically, it's saying exactly the same, it's just a different conversion. So a percentile score tells us where a child will be performing in a given area if, say, 100 children were stood in a row. So it's out of 100 as a percentage, a percentile. So, for example, if attaining a percentile score of 50, 49 will be performing worse and 50 performing better. Now, sometimes that in itself can be quite tricky to kind of get your head around. And we don't always, because of that, use percentile scores in our reports. But we would know roughly that if somebody was in the well below average area, we're looking towards the left-hand side of the screen, or probably that way as you're looking at it. So the left-hand side of the screen as it's going down to the well below average. So the well below average area will be the lower percentile and the opposite way around. So if you can see, we've got some indication of where those percentiles sit in that bell curve that we showed you before. But I would say, generally speaking, concentrate more on the standard score because that's a little bit easier to kind of understand and interpret sometimes than it is a percentile score. And you don't have to put percentile scores in reports now anyway under the SASC standards. So you may or you may not see those in the report that you're given, dependent upon which assessor actually does your particular assessment. Okay.
Okay, so we wanted to talk through a couple of terms that you might find in your reports, and there's something that assessors refer to as a significant statistical difference. Okay, and when I was doing my training, this totally flummoxed me because quite often I would think that if you had a score of 90 and a score of 96, that to me felt quite different, but felt quite a big difference, but actually it isn't. What we have to do is we have to allow for variance in scores because actually nobody is going to score completely in a row. Even if you haven't got a specific learning difficulty, you're going to have areas of strength. So we have to allow for a particular range. Okay, and reports sometimes use the term statistically significant. Okay. And what that basically means is that we're looking for a difference, that if we think back to the standardised scores and that they've been tested with loads and loads of children of the same age, we're looking for something which is unusual. Basically, what it means is that the difference between the scores is considered unusual. It hasn't happened in very many incidences. Okay, and generally we're looking for a statistical difference of at least 15 points. So in order for something to be statistically different and significant, we're looking for at least 15 points. However, each assessment varies, and it's our job as assessors to make sure we look in the manuals and make sure we're identifying and pointing out those differences that are significant. If there are any, there aren't always significant differences, okay, but it's our job as assessors to point those out to you. Okay, and the other term I wanted to talk about was confidence intervals, which is on the next slide. And again, we have to allow for variation in performance because, you know, we all have good days, we all have bad days. I'm having a really bad day today, I'm struggling to get my words out. And I think sometimes as an assessor as well, we can kind of use our instinct. We'll know, even if you don't know a child, you kind of get a gut feeling as to whether that child is performing in their usual way or whether they're performing slightly better than they would usually perform. And we use confidence intervals to do that. And I guess, I think back to when I was a Senko in school, you could guarantee the day that the educational psychologist came in to assess the kid that you knew was really struggling, the kid would have a really good day. But we as assessors are kind of used to that and can kind of take that into account. And actually, this is where confidence intervals can be really useful, because confidence intervals are a way of gaining a score that shows a range that the child is likely to perform in. Okay, and it's where I think real life assessment and assessor's instinct and expert knowledge is absolutely paramount. Okay, and if we look in the little star there, we've got 98 to 113. And that confidence range would indicate that a child would be performing, that's an average confidence range, and it would mean that that child on a different day could perform anywhere within that range. I think the other thing that's important to say is lots of the assessments that are used can't be re-administered the next day, but hypothetically, if you were, those children would kind of, the scores would fall in that range. Okay, and as I said, it's really about knowing the child and being able to read the child's behaviour and look at that alongside the scores. And I think, again, that's where, you know, having a qualified assessor and having somebody that's really experienced can be really beneficial, because we know what we're looking for. We've assessed hundreds and hundreds of children, and we know what we're looking for, and we can kind of, you can guess, you can often, not guess, but you can often, you've got a real gut feeling for whether a child is doing what they normally do or not. Confidence intervals aren't always used in reports. I don't refer to them in every report, but they are another term and something we can use if we need to. I think I'm back to you, Karen.
Yes, thank you. So, following on then, key things that we're looking for. We need to have a grasp of the individual's underlying ability. Where are they working at? In their non-verbal skills, their visual skills, their verbal skills, and their spatial skills. Where are they working with their problem solving and reasoning? Where are they working with their understanding and use of language? So when we move on, and I mentioned to you that a screener looks at an awful lot more, this is really where it comes into its own. We need to kind of delve a lot more deeply and see where their strengths are. Quite often there may be very creative, non-verbal visual strengths. They may be very good verbally. They may have a great range of verbal expression, lots of words verbally, but then trying to get that down on paper and use that language is something that we might see as an anomaly, if you like. It's not necessarily the same person speaking as the same person in writing. So where is that underarching ability? Are they sitting within their age range, or are they slightly over or under where they ought to be performing for their age? So we need to look at that in a lot more detail. And the diagnostic assessment will bring that detail to us. Okay. So I've mentioned earlier a little bit about a spiky profile. So to diagnose dyslexia, generally we look for this spike. We look for those peaks and troughs. We look for not something where an individual is working on a flat line basis, but where we've got some generally good ability and some particularly maybe poor ability or weaker challenges that we need to have a look at. So when we're looking at underlying ability profiles, we tend to use particular tests, and one of them is the RIT, the Wide Range Intelligence Test. Now this Wide Range Intelligence Test will look at verbal and non-verbal, the visual tests, to see where that person is working at for their own underlying ability. And if we have a little look at this that Joe did for us very nicely, we can see a bit of a profile here. And this is looking at the RIT, breaking it down into a raw score, a standard score, and a percentile, similarly to what we looked at and I spoke about earlier. So when we do any testing, obviously it's got to give us a starting point. So it gives us a raw score, it gives us something to work on. And that raw score is then converted into a standard score, which will also give us a percentile ranking, if you like. So if we have a look at the first blue table on the left-hand side, and we look down just purely the standard score areas here, we can see this individual is working at a range of scores from the lowest being 64 to the highest being 87. So I would know instinctively, because I've worked with these standard scores for quite a while, that that's a score within the well below average range to the high average ranges. So there's already a little bit of a peak there. Analogies and vocabulary, that looks at the verbal underlying ability. Matrices and diamonds looks at the non-verbal, the visual skills. So we can see that there's already a mix there. And that's one particular profile. If we look over at the other side, there's another profile. So another person can work differently. Their underlying ability set or skills are different because we're all unique. So even within a profile of dyslexia, you are going to find variances, but we still need to look at that overall spiky profile, if you like, to see where that individual is sitting.
Can I just interrupt you, Karen?
Please do.
Because I've just realised we didn't remove the this means we're looking for standard scores over 85 or above. And actually, I don't think we've said at any point, have we, that dyslexia can occur across a range of abilities.
Yes.
So even though that first table, and that's why I actually picked that first table, even though the scores are in a low and a low average range, they're spiky within that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's not, sorry, it's just the red bit wasn't quite right. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, thank you, Jo. Thank you for reminding me. So
sorry.
No, I'm glad you did. We're looking for underlying ability over a range of different scores. Now, underlying ability, you might also want to look at it as an intelligence test. The wide range intelligence test is an underlying ability test. But as Jo says, we're not looking for intelligence as being a particular level. We are really looking for a range or a continuum of standard scores across a range of intellectual ability or underlying ability profile. So that's really important to look at. We are really looking for areas of strength. So we would be expecting to find some areas of strength here in the underlying ability profile, but also to be saying that we're not always looking for Einsteins and geniuses either at the opposite end. So it can be that we're basing our diagnosis on a range of intellectual ability, not just a particular standard score. So it kind of goes a little bit back to what we were looking at with confidence intervals and the ranges within which a person is sitting. Is that okay, Jo? Is that where we want to say? Yeah. Okay. So we're not always looking at that, but often there are strengths in that visual and verbal ability. So as we've already mentioned, we are looking for a general profile. And we're looking for specific strengths. Now, I would say that I would be looking for strengths with visual spatial skills, with problem solving, with looking at being able to maybe be a good puzzle solver, because a dyslexic brain is generally, but not always, generally a right side dominant creative. So we're looking for areas of strength. Now, that may or may not be in a verbal skill. So we're looking for the differences between where that individual is sitting. And this particular profile that you can see here is looking at a range of scores from the average to the high average ranges. And again, it's about putting that picture together to see that on its own isn't telling us much in a dyslexic profile, but it's saying where they are sitting within underlying ability. If we match that with literacy attainment and other cognitive arrangements that person is working at, that will start to build that profile. On the right hand side there, you can see we've mentioned the RIT that we use, but there's also other areas or tests that other assessors may use, other educational psychologists may use, different banks of testing, looking for the same skill. So within your report, there will be underlying ability profile scores, and they'll also say what tests were used to actually give that information.
Okay, so Karen has just explained the underlying ability, which if we think back to our triangle from earlier, that was one side of the full diagnostic triangle. I'm going to talk now a bit about the attainment side and kind of what we're looking for. So as Karen said, we're looking to start to build that picture, and we're starting to kind of build a bit of a profile of needs. So when we're looking at attainment, we're looking at literacy, and we're looking at maths. And the reason why we do that is because we want to get a standard measure of where that young person is currently performing. We also might want to look to see if there's any underattainment compared to their ability. Again, this isn't crucial, but it's one of the things that we look for. Okay, and we're going to look to assess word reading. And when we're looking at word reading, what we're looking for is it allows us to see how a person is reading. We can also look at what strategies and approaches they are able to use when the word is out of context. So quite often, you find actually I've just done a couple of assessments recently where they've got a really good sight vocabulary, so they can come out quite high in word reading because they're able to recall words quite quickly. But when it comes to reading in context, they're having to work so much harder, so they find it much more difficult to comprehend. Or it may be that they're really good at word reading, but they're having to attack every single word. They're having to break down every single word they come across. So therefore, when it comes to comprehending, it's going to be much more difficult because they're going to have to decode and attack every single word. So we're looking at what approaches they're using at reading single words to begin with. Then we look at word spelling, and this allows us to see what approaches they're using when spelling. And then we're going to look at sentence reading and sentence comprehension. And this allows us to see how well a person can read in context. Again, it allows us to see what approaches they're using when reading. And it allows us to gain a formal measure of what they're actually understanding when reading. And because we're using standard scores, because the assessments we use give us a standard score, we're able to measure that directly against the underlying ability standard scores, which we've already got. And I have actually got a profile that I want to share with you on the next slide. So, okay. We're not looking for particular standard scores in the attainment tests, okay? Anything is acceptable and could lead to a diagnosis, okay? What we're doing is building a picture of a person's strengths and need, okay? We want to directly measure the attainment standard scores next to the underlying ability standard scores. And we also want to gain an understanding of how a person is approaching literacy tasks to decide which diagnostic assessments to administer. Okay, and in this table I've got here, you can see the blue is the RIT, the underlying ability bit that Karen has just explained. And the red underneath is the attainment test. So I use the RAT, the wide range attainment test, which is one test that specialist assessors use. Okay, and we can see with this particular profile, if we look at the standard scores, which is the third column in, we can see that the scores for the attainment for the RAT are quite a lot lower than their standard scores for the RIT. So that shows me that that young person is under-attaining in literacy compared to their ability. So I'm going to want to do some diagnostic tests to look at what's going on. Why is that young person not attaining in line with their ability? Okay, and then on the next slide, I've got another profile to share with you. Okay, this profile shows the person to be attaining in literacy compared to his ability. So if we look at the standard scores again, okay, which is the second numerical column in, we can see that actually the red standard scores, so 197 and 109, are more or less in line with the ability scores. Okay, so there isn't much under attainment there. However, whilst I assess him, I noticed the following things. During the word reading, he could only read words in his sight vocabulary. When approaching an unknown word, he was never able to read it correctly. So that means when he got to a word that he wasn't able to recall automatically and he had to sound it out, he wasn't able to sound it out and blend it back together correctly. The spelling responses showed me that the pupil was missing whole syllables from words. Often, vowel sounds were not correctly identified, and the higher score in reading comprehension compared to word reading indicates he could be using his language ability to compensate for poor decoding skills, guessing words. And if Sarah clicks the button again, He took a long time to read the sentence comprehension and was noted to reread often. So again, even though he was able to comprehend, he was having to read it a couple of times to be able to make sense of it. Okay, and that pointed out to me the following things. Okay, potentially there's a difficulty with phonological awareness there. There's also potentially a difficulty with phonological processing. And there's also potentially a difficulty with his verbal naming speed, so the speed that he's able to recall information. Okay, so I know that I'm going to go on and need to do some diagnostic tests looking at those things. So if we move on to the next slide, okay, we're now going to think about that final side of the triangle. We're going to think about the diagnostic assessments that measure specific areas. Okay, and we look at specific areas of need and difficulty, and these are the diagnostic assessments. And we're looking at this point now for varied and far removed from each other standard scores. Okay, so really we are looking for statistical differences. Okay, and we're going to measure phonological awareness, maybe phonological memory. We're going to be measuring working and short-term memory, verbal naming, handwriting speed, reading fluency and accuracy, speed to recall sight words. We might want to measure of how people is attacking words, and we might want to measure verbal compared to visual memory. Now, the other thing to say here is no assessor will ever administer every single test that they own. By this point, we'll have quite a sort of good, strong gut feeling of which diagnostic tests we do to kind of prove our point, if you want, because we've got a good idea at this point what's going on. And the following slides, we're going to talk through these things in a bit more detail. And I'm going to hand back to you now, Karen.
Thank you very much, Jo. Yes, so I'm going to look a little bit at phonological awareness, and this is one of the key areas. If we think back to the definition that we looked at from the British Dyslexia Association, one of the things they mentioned there was looking at a person's phonological awareness. So that's our ability to be able to hear and process sounds. Quite often, as specialist assessors, we use a CTOP, been updated to CTOP 2 now, and the FAB. And that will give us a range of subtests that will look at how an individual attacks sounds, how they say sounds, how they read sounds, how they blend sounds, how they put them together. Any difficulties with phonological awareness will affect word reading and spelling. A person with difficulties with phonological awareness will find it difficult to identify and discriminate between sounds orally and auditory. So they may hear sounds differently. And one of the things we always look for in our background information is where is that person sitting with their hearing as well. And that's something to consider. When was the last time that individual had a hearing test? Have we had any problems with hearing as a youngster? Because that could affect the phonological awareness skills if the words or the sounds of letters have not been heard particularly well and remembered well. Difficulties with phonological awareness will affect how we match those letters to sounds. So we know that we've got 26 letters of the alphabet, but we've got an awful lot more sounds, phonemes that go with those letters of the alphabet. And that's why when an individual tries to spell a word that they don't know, they will attack it phonetically. They will try and spell it as it sounds. And that's where we know we get lots of different attack of words, if you like, lots of different spellings that don't match, because they're trying to put two areas together that don't work well. It's not easy to spell a word phonetically because our language is so difficult. It's not an easy language to learn in that way. So what we're looking for is where a pupil will substitute, may put similar sounds together. S and X or S and X can sound the same. Pupils who are unable to identify all sounds when spelling, again going back to that phonetic issue with spelling. And if a profile shows us a standard score of below 85, we know that that person is working in a below average range for that particular skill. So that's one of the areas that we really need to focus on. It's one of the big key indicators as to whether we're working with a person with a dyslexic profile or not, whether there are difficulties with this phonological awareness skill. Okay. The other area that we tend to look at as well is working and short-term memory. Over the last few years, there's been a lot more research and suggestion that working memory is one of the key elements, if you like, to put in a dyslexic profile together. There was lots of research by Badley and Alloway working on particular working memory, and you'll see that we prefer to use a definition that includes working memory because we feel that it is an important aspect. So why do we look at working memory? Well, working memory is our ability to hold information and do something with it before moving into long-term memory. You might find that an individual is finding it hard to hold an instruction. They may forget what happened at the beginning of a 5-step instruction and only remember the end bit because they can't hold that information in their working memory long enough to be able to do something with it. And if we have a difficulty with working in short-term memory, it will affect our word reading and spelling because working memory is not sufficient to be able to remember all of the sounds when reading. It can affect the order sounds are remembered in. And it may be that pupils are still working hard, very, very hard, because the mechanics of reading are difficult, but it's actually taking too much of their working memory. And so there's no space left to make sense of what they've read, because if they're not attacking the words well, if their sight vocabulary isn't good and they're having to sound out, going back to phonological awareness, every individual letter within a word, and their word attack isn't good, they're taking all their working memory space, if you like, just to sound out those particular words, try and make sense of those words, but then putting that together in a whole sentence context or a whole paragraph, it's lost. It's not remembered, it's forgotten so easily. So that's what we're looking for when we're assessing. We're looking for pupils who are unable to hold information and do something with it. The difficulties with sounding or blending words, sounds and letters missing in spelling, and again, that standardised score below 85 will show that the individual is working at a below average range. And the tests that we may use again for working memory, there is the phonological memory side of the CTOP, but also TOML. TOML and TOML 2 are really useful tests to use of a test for memory and learning. Okay. The other area, verbal naming speeds. So, verbal naming speed is our ability to be able to hear and name, recall visual information at speed. So the speed in which we process information is a really important area that we look at. Why is that? Well, it will affect fluent reading. It will be slow for the individual to sound individual letters, making it difficult to blend the word. They're spending so long processing that they're not able to actually follow that through, and they will need to reread the text quite often to make sense of it. So as assessors, we're looking for pupils that cannot name letters or sounds fluently, that it takes a long time, and we do tests that are tested with speed, if you like. So we get the stopwatch out and we test to see where that individual is working at in their speed, and that's really important because that tells us a great deal about how long it's taking their brain, if you like, to process the information that's in front of them. Pupils who take a long pause before naming information as well, that's a really important telling sign to us. And where they may where a pupil can't read so well because the speed is very slow compared to other areas of attainment. So to be able to actually test with speed is an important element as well. We need to see how quickly or how slowly that processing is taking place. And again, type of tests that we might use, CTOP and TOWRY, or their second versions now, look at rapid naming, and we can compare that with their sight vocabulary under timed conditions, because that's important when we look at exams down the line. How quickly is it taking that person to be able to perform a skill, and will it give us an indication that they may need extra time to process, especially under exam conditions? Okay.
Okay, so we might also want to look at reading accuracy and fluency, and I've actually got a really great picture that I wish I'd included. I've got a brilliant picture of a swan, and on top of the water, the swan is just beautiful and still, but then underneath you can see the legs going like 900 miles to the dozen, okay, to keep itself afloat, okay. And actually there are quite a lot, particularly when it comes to exam access arrangements. It's not unusual to assess people that are actually attaining average or beyond, but are working really, really hard to stay there. So we might want to look at reading accuracy and fluency, and this is our ability to be able to read quickly and fluently without making any errors, okay. And this affects how we're able to attack words and make sense of what we have to read. Obviously the speed we're able to read, in the amount of times we need to read it to make sense, because in an exam we don't have time to read things 10 times. I know it takes me a good couple of times to make sense of things, because the first time I read, I just have to read it and decode the words, and then the second time I can read, I know what those words say, so I can start to make sense of it a bit more. But also, if we're really bumpy when we read, it's going to affect our enjoyment and our ease of reading, and if it's hard work, we're just not going to enjoy it. So what, as assessors, we're looking for, we will be looking for how many times a pupil needs to read something to be able to make sense of it. We'll be looking at how many words a reader is having to sound out and decode. So, for example, are they having to break down and sound out every single word they come across, or are they relying largely on their sight vocabulary? We'll also be looking for a mismatch between word reading and comprehension, and possibly reading speed. And the test that we use to do that, we might use the RAP4, we might use the GORT, the Grey Oral Reading Test, or we might use the YARC. So those tests will give us, they will look at more than comprehension. They give us a fluency score, and they also give us an accuracy score. Okay, the next area that we might want to look at is handwriting speed. And again, this isn't something that we always need to look at, but it can help build a bit more to that picture. And obviously, handwriting speed affects our ability to get ideas onto paper quickly. And again, thinking of anecdotes and thinking of my son, he's so verbally articulate and can tell you anything you need to know about anything, but it comes to writing down and he just can't get it onto paper. And quite often, the assessments we use are, I use are the DASH, the detailed assessment of speed of handwriting, and there's the DASH 17 plus as well for older learners. But quite often I will do the handwriting test last, so I'll have got to know my learner that I'm working with quite well by then, and quite often the writing just does not fit with the rest of what you've seen. The vocabulary used is simple and it just kind of doesn't reflect everything else. So if we're struggling with handwriting and handwriting speed, it's going to affect how we're able to record our learning and ideas. If we're still having to think about how letters are formed, that's going to take up working memory space. Karen talked earlier about how we only have kind of a limited working memory capacity. And if we're still having to think about how to form letters, that's going to take up space. And if we're still having to think about how to spell words, that's going to slow our thinking down as well. So assessors are going to look for pupils whose writing does not reflect the rest of their profile. We're going to be looking in that writing to see, does the vocabulary really reflect the type of vocabulary that that young person is using? And we're going to generally be looking for scores that are below 85. And the last area which we look at is we might want to look at reading approaches, and we do use assessments to do this, but actually some of this is holistic as well. Some of it, the more assessments you do, you just get a kind of a bit of a feel really for how people are approaching their reading. So we're going to look at sight vocabulary versus decoding ability. So we're going to look at our ability to be able to recall words and break words down and move to and from long-term memory automatically. It's going to affect how fluently and quickly we're able to read. If we can't recall words really quickly, it's going to make comprehending text difficult. So if we've got a really good sight vocabulary, it's going to make comprehending text easier, as we don't have to break down and sound every word out. Again, if we're recalling words automatically from sight vocabulary, that's going to take strain away from working memory, which is going to leave capacity for us to be able to actually make sense of what we're reading. If we can recall words automatically, it's going to make reading an enjoyable experience, because if we're having to decode every single word, it's going to be hard work and there will be no enjoyment from reading. And again, it's not unusual to come across learners who are just fantastic at the mechanics of reading. They know exactly how to attack words, they know exactly how to break them down, but they can't comprehend what they're reading at all. And that brings me back to my image of my swan, that it looks like they're doing a fantastic job, and the minute you ask them a question about what they've read, they've got absolutely no idea. So as assessors, we're looking for how a pupil is reading. Are they reading only using sight vocabulary, or are they breaking every word down? We're looking for pupils who are unable to identify all the sounds or sound letters incorrectly when reading and spelling. And again, that's not unusual to come, particularly when words become what we call multisyllabic, so more than one syllable, to have young people that just have no idea how to attack that word and how to group the letters into digraphs or syllables. They're still relying on sound, what we call sound letter correspondence. So they're sounding each letter individually, which obviously means they're never going to be able to sound it or blend it correctly. We're possibly also looking for a mismatch between sight vocabulary and decoding ability. And the common tests we use to look at that are the Towery 2 and the RAT4. Probably more the Towery 2, that gives us the comparison between sight recall, and you ask them to recall as many sight words as they can in 45 seconds, and then you ask them to recall as many non-words as they can in 45 seconds, and that stumps lots of people, including me. I find that quite difficult to do. So yeah, if we then look at the next slide, I've got a profile for you here, and you can see that if we think back to our triangle, we've got all three sides of our triangle now. We've got the blue underlying ability side, we've got the red attainment side, and we've got the green diagnostic side. Okay, and we can see that this profile here, if we look at the standard scores, is a spiky profile. It's got areas of strength compared to areas of difficulty. So for example, if we look at the Rip Diamond standard score, that's a score of 116 compared to the phonological awareness score, which is in the CTOP green box at the top of the page, of 76. We can see there that we've got a real range of scores. Okay, and if we unpick this profile a little bit more, this young person has got strengths in visual ability. Attainment in literacy is in line with verbal ability, but isn't in line with visual ability. And again, that's not uncommon. The CTOP scores, so the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing scores, indicate difficulties in every single area. So phonological memory, rapid naming, and phonological awareness, that all of those scores are below 80 in the low range. The sight word in the Towery, which is the second green box down, shows speed to recall words is below average. Okay, so even though they were accurate, you can see there's a score of 89, which only just tips into below average. But actually, if we compare that with our word reading and then with our sentence comprehension, there's a real kind of interesting up and down profile there. And if comparing the RAT sentence comprehension with the GORT accuracy, so the GORT is the bottom green box, and fluency, we can see a significant difference. So the RAT sentence comprehension, we've got a score of 106. And if we look at the comprehension, which is in the very bottom box there, the standard score, it's 85. So you can see how now we've got a completed picture and how spiky those scores are, how they range from 113 right down to, I think, 75 is the lowest standard score. Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Karen, who's going to talk about complications now.
Okay.
Oh, that was another profile. Do you want me to talk through that one as well?
Yeah, you can if you like.
Shall I talk through that one?
You need a drink?
Skip that one. Move on to the next one. I think we cut that one out, didn't we?
Yeah. Okay. So we're looking at this one, or we're skipping this one as well? What should we do, ladies?
No, I think you should read that one.
Okay.
Do you want me?
Right, so we've got some, we'll move on. We can go, because we can broadcast this, you can see them anyway. But we were just looking at where there may be some complications, where we think that there could be some areas within a profile that we just need to look at in a little bit more detail. So we're looking at common reasons why an assessor might not provide a diagnosis. It is common. It's not as common, but it is common. It can happen where we do a diagnostic assessment and we say, actually, what we've got in front of us here isn't enough to provide a diagnosis. It's maybe giving us strengths of areas of strength, and areas of limitations, but it's not giving us a full diagnosis that we need to work on. And that can happen. And that's okay for it to happen, because we don't want to misdiagnose. That's really important. We can still also give recommendations, even if it's not a full diagnosis. So some of the reasons why we may not diagnose, it could be because of the age of the pupil. It might be that that pupil still needs to be sure that the intervention has been tried, need to be sure that they have gone through all their developmental stages. That's really important. We need to think about when we're starting to assess, and are we starting at the right age range for that individual. We can diagnose from the age of 6, but assessors will be wary of this because that individual may not have gone through all their developmental stages. And so we need to think, do they need to carry on with their learning first before we do a fuller diagnosis? There may be a range of scores in the profile which give too much of a difference. So huge differences in underlying ability scores. Underlying ability scores all being in the below average range would suggest a more general learning difference. So I mentioned earlier on that we look at a spiky profile, we look at those peaks and troughs. If the range of scores give us more of a general line, so there's very little in the scoring ups or downs, then it shows that they're working pretty much to their general learning ability. So that could be a general learning difference because a lot of the scores are pretty much in line and not spiky. We might find, though, however, that there are certain areas that need exploring a little bit more. For instance, an individual who might score average or high average or well above average in certain areas, but then particularly low in a particular range. Maybe working memory is particularly poor. Why might it be particularly poor? Or attention and concentration might be particularly poor, but literacy attainment and underlying ability is quite good. So sometimes we need to think about the wider picture. It could be that there are sensory processing disorders. It could be that attention deficit hyperactivity is there. It could be that a learner's on the autistic spectrum, but it's not enough to give us a diagnosis of dyslexia that we're particularly looking for, but it could give us some indications of other co-occurrence or coexistence, if you like, of other specific learning differences. And that's what we're looking for as an assessor. We're looking at the whole picture before we can actually give a diagnosis. And sometimes it's out of our remit to do that, and we need to hand that back to another professional to dig a little bit more deeply. It might be that with dyspraxia, say, they need to go down the medical route, or they need particular interventions in school that will just help to look to see that if those interventions are in place, that learning will will occur, and that will put that learner back onto the track that they ought to be for their age range. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense as to why we may not be able to do a diagnosis. Okay. So we've looked at what makes up the diagnosis now. We've looked at that spiky profile. Not always, but often a strength in visual and non-verbal ability. We have to look at that literacy attainment and the maths attainment scores. So we also look at the green areas as well. The handwriting speed, the reading accuracy, fluency, all those green bubbles there make up that full diagnosis. So if we go back a little bit to where we started and the journey that we've just come down, that screener doesn't give us all this information. It's that starting point. What gives us the full information, what makes up the diagnosis, are all the extra bits of the jigsaw, all the extra tests that we've done, all the background information that we've gleaned, all the things we've observed at the time of assessment that will give us a bigger, better picture to say, yes, this is a dyslexic profile, or no, this isn't a dyslexic profile. We need to pass that on to another professional, or we need to just look into a little bit more detail and do a little bit more unravelling as to where that individual is sitting. Okay.
Thanks, Karen. So we're coming towards the end now. So what makes up a diagnosis? So I said earlier, we don't always need to administer all the assessments. What we're doing is building a picture of need. Equally, sometimes we have to dig a bit deeper and to find what we wish to prove. And I think it's really important to say that assessment data only tells part of the story, okay? So we also need to be looking at current attainment in school, we need to be looking at background, and we need to be looking at, I don't know what that one says, we also need to be looking at the behaviour and the approach to the tasks as well. And actually, this is why sometimes we as assessors will look at scores and disagree with each other. And I mean, we've got a really good network of assessors, but quite often we will send profiles through to each other, just scores to kind of look at, to support, to ensure that we're kind of thinking on the same lines. And actually, a diagnosis is made up of many factors, and the scores only tell you one part of that story. And if it's done properly, an assessor will be able to prove their kind of thinking, but by observations as well as by other evidence collected. The scores only give part of the story, okay? And this is why it's imperative that a qualified assessor carries out the assessment, because we know what we're looking for. We have to do regular CPD to make sure we keep up to date with current research and current thinking, and you know, it's quite rigorous what we have to go through to ensure that our reports and our thinking meets the right standard. So to think about then the summary of differences between the screener and the full assessment. A screener, it's one assessment tool. It only looks at one side of that assessment triangle. It's not standardized. Non-specialists can administer them, and screeners don't diagnose. And it's so common for parents to come to me waving a dyslexia portfolio or a dyslexia screen and say, school have said my child's dyslexic. And you kind of have to unpick that and say, yes, there is strong evidence that they're at risk, but actually this isn't a full diagnostic assessment. Okay, so if we're looking for a full assessment, what we're looking for is it's a battery of tests exploring a range of needs, including underlying ability. It's looking at all three sides of the assessment triangle. The assessments we use are standardised, which means they can be compared to each other and they build a picture of need. Only specialists can administer many of the assessments used, and they can provide a diagnosis if necessary and appropriate. So to just finalise then, if we go back to our assessment triangle, that's the picture of need that we've built up. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding now of what that underlying ability is, what current attainment is, the word reading, word spelling, maths and comprehension. And hopefully you'll have a much better understanding of those specific areas of need that we look into that make up a dyslexic diagnosis. I'm going to hand over to Karen now, who's going to talk quickly about Erlen. You're on mute, Karen. Here's
me rushing and forgetting that I put on mute. we wanted to highlight really Erlen a little bit here, because quite often what we find is happening in a lot of instances is where a screener has been taken place and an individual may be found to be at high risk of dyslexia. A school or an individual may go straight to a coloured overlay, go through a coloured overlay pack with an individual and say, there you go, your screener says you're dyslexic, so please have a coloured overlay. We just want to do a bit of myth busting here really. You don't have to go straight to a coloured overlay. A coloured overlay will not cure dyslexia. It may help with visual stress, but a coloured overlay should only really be administered if we feel that there are reading distortions. And to have an Erlen assessment looks at visual perception problems. And visual perception problems can be found within the environment, can be found on the page in the way of distortions, and can give an individual lots of physical and behavioural symptoms. So you may have an individual, a child, who finds it really hard to articulate why it is they're having difficulties with reading. If you imagine, and on the screen there you can see some text that looks a little bit odd. If you're reading text and that's how it's looking, that's giving you some distortion issues. That's saying that, well, I can't read it very well, or I'm not enjoying reading per se, because the word is moving, or it's shaky, or it's showing I can see all the white on the page and very little of the words. So somebody's going to definitely have difficulties with reading. So we might say, well, a dyslexic person could have difficulties with reading. Yes, they could, but they may not see these distortions. Now, what we're finding is Erlen syndrome itself is a specific type of perceptual problem. It's different to dyslexia. It's a standalone condition. It may interlink with dyslexia, but it is different. It affects the way the brain processes visual information. There isn't a problem with the eyes. So when you go to the optician, you may have fantastic sight reading, sight seeing, not a problem, don't need glasses to correct that, but an individual is still having problems with reading because of the distortions, or because the environment is too bright for them. It could be that they have visual stress, or they have light sensitivity. I have light sensitivity. I find it very, very difficult in light situations, but I don't have reading distortions. So Erlen syndrome itself covers a range of a spectrum, if you like, and that's really important to look at it as a separate issue, a separate condition. The brain is unable to process the full spectral light. So it's the way in which the eyes are sending the information to the brain, and it's actually a difficulty in which the brain is receiving the information and processing it that's causing this Erlen syndrome. So what we really wanted to get across, that dyslexia and Erlen syndrome are two separate entities, and in order to have an Erlen screening, you do need a certified Erlen practitioner who's been certified to do so. There are on the market an awful lot of different coloured overlays that people can buy. Crossbow, for instance, do a selection of different coloured overlays. They're not Erlen. They are their own ways of using coloured overlays to help minimise visual stress, which might help a dyslexic person or a non-dyslexic person. But again, it's only the Erlen overlays and the Erlen system of testing that will tell you whether you have Erlen syndrome or not. So I hope that helps to put that into perspective for those that may have been wondering about that. Okay, so let's conclude. So we've now got where we started. We've got that lovely dyslexia definition, and we've got all the colours that Jo went through before. If you can remember her beautiful keyboard showing the spectrum of dyslexia, we're looking at all those areas to build a bigger picture. We're looking at a range of assessments. Lots of different things need to be taken into account. and there has to be strengths and difficulties, areas of challenges that we're looking for to glean that spiky profile. So we're looking for areas that affect development of literacy and language. We're looking for difficulty with the phonological processing, rapid naming, working memory, processing speeds, and the automaticity, the difficulty in doing that in an automatic way that affects a person's cognitive abilities. So it's quite a full picture that we need in order to get that full diagnosis, and that's why it is completely different to where we start with that screen. Okay, thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much. I think we're there. We got to the end.
So we've got a few questions in our question boxes. Here we go.
I'm sorry, wait a minute. Right. Bear with me, sorry.
It's okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Do you want to go through the Q&A, ladies?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Heather is asking, does PATOS request percentile scores, or would standardized scores be okay? Generally speaking, when we go through our APC, our assessment practicing certificate, it can change actually as to what we need to put in our reports. And generally speaking, the standardized scores is really important. You don't have to put a percentile score in the body of the actual report. You may want to put the percentile score in the table at the end, but it's more important actually that you put the confidence intervals. So really it's the standard scores and the confidence intervals that we're looking for. So for PATOS you may not see that, but remember you're going to get assessors who will be doing assessments, and they'll be standardised across a range of different bodies. Educational psychologists can also do assessments, and they may want to put percentiles into their assessment reports. But for PATOS, no, not necessarily throughout the body, and it's down to the individual assessor, really.
It's something that I've seen in the past used to support requests for statements and education healthcare plans. They might be looking for sort of significantly low percentile scores of 5 or under. So like you say, Karen, it's kind of used for something different. It's not necessarily something we would use automatically in our reports, but it's something that may be asked to be seen. And if you've got a standard score, you can turn that into we've got a conversion table to turn that into a percentile score.
Okay, thank you. Posey mentions that she thought that scientists had debunked the right brain, left brain thinking. Yeah, it's always been a little bit of a myth, I suppose, but I still like that. I still think that there is right brain dominance, actually, hemisphere dominance, and I think from all the training that I've done, that it's not always the case, but generally speaking, there will be some dominance there in the creative side, the non-literacy left brain thinking side. I don't know whether you would agree with that, Jo.
Yeah, you're the brain expert, in all honesty.
Yeah, that's why for me neuroscience, I still like it. I still like to use it. I think it just gives us a better indication of maybe what's going on in the brain.
Yeah. In terms of the question about the PowerPoint, we're not sending the PowerPoint out, but the PowerPoint will be on the webinar, won't it, Sarah? So you'll be able to view it from that.
Yeah, it is recorded, so I will send you out the recording.
Well done. Okay, Joanna, can the diagnosis determine a mild to severe dyslexia result? If so, how can you tell from the scores what you are? This is always a tricky one to answer, and quite often parents will want to know how dyslexic their child is. And if we think back to that keyboard at the beginning, I think a diagnosis of dyslexia is a diagnosis of dyslexia. For me, it's more about how dyslexia is impacting on your life. Would you agree with that, Karen?
Yeah, definitely.
And actually, you know, to get a diagnosis of dyslexia, you have to meet the criteria, and it's about the strategies that you're taught and the strategies and the recommendations that are put in place to bridge the gap to stop that dyslexia from impacting on your life significantly.
I think it's important as well that sometimes some screeners may come out and say, oh, it's a mild or a moderate or a severe dyslexia. In all of my training that I've done to date, I've always been told to stress the fact that dyslexia is dyslexia. Yes, it might be working across a continuum, but it's important to see where that dyslexia fits within that particular profile. And just because it comes out as mild doesn't mean it shouldn't have an intervention put in place. And I think that is the difficulty here, that if the word mild is seen, it's almost as if it's saying, well, it doesn't really matter, it's only mild. Well, that's wrong. It does matter because it's dyslexia. Whether it's mild or moderate or severe, it doesn't matter, it's dyslexia, and therefore it needs to be acted upon. And I think that's the misconception. Would you say?
And I think you don't know how hard somebody is working for that to just be mild.
Yeah, and also what they're doing at the time. They might be more effective doing one area of learning than they would something else. And if the teacher has this misconception that they're not that dyslexic, then, you know, is that support going to be put in place?
Yeah, and I mean, I got all the way through. I didn't get diagnosed until I was 34. I went the whole way through university because I was that swan. I just kept, you know, because I think for me, I didn't know any different. That was, I thought everybody worked as hard as I worked. So I think sometimes you don't necessarily, you as the learner don't have anything to compare it to.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's an anonymous one there, Karen, for you about Erlen.
Okay. Can you explain what an Erlen screen? Can you see me, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. I can't. I've just missed some of my screen, so apologies for those that are looking at me and I'm looking a bit blank. Can you explain what an Erlen screener does, and are they different? Yes. Okay. Right. So an Erlen screener is the start of the process, if you like. So a little bit like a dyslexia screener, although it's more than a screener. The wording is a little bit difficult here because it's an Erlen assessment. So I may be termed as an Erlen screener, but I'm actually an Erlen assessor, but it's classed as an Erlen screen. So that's where the terminology makes for life being a little bit complicated. So I will assess to see whether that person has Erlen. And in order to do that, we look at coloured overlays, we look at the visual distortions, there's some tests that we do. If I can say, yes, that person has Erlen syndrome, it might be that we give them the overlays and they go away with the overlays, and that's only good for when they're reading. But what happens when they're out in the environment? What happens when they're missing steps and hesitant on stairs and trip over a lot and are really light sensitive and have an awful lot of headaches? They don't have the overlays with them then. So that's where we would say they've got visual perception problems in the environment. And somebody who's got more environmental issues with Erlen syndrome, we would suggest the Erlen lenses, because that's going to help in every walk of life. Just as we wear prescription glasses for reading and distance, if you need them for a prescription, you can have the coloured lenses, the colours added to the lenses. Or it might be that you don't need a prescription to read or for distance, but you do still need the colour. So the next step is to go to what we call an Erlen diagnostician, and the diagnostician then does the Erlen lenses. So that's not me. I'm not yet qualified to do that, but I do the first stage, so I can assess to say yes or no for Erlen. My report then would go off to the person doing the diagnosis for the lenses, and then they take that next step, if you like. So you don't have to have the coloured lenses. If the overlays are working sufficiently, that's all that you need. But for me, say, I do need my coloured lenses because I need it in the environment, and I don't necessarily need it just for reading. So I hope that's helped.
So Sam's question, what are the main things missing from screeners that could be argued, in brackets, with schools to push for diagnosis further assessment? It's quite a difficult one to answer from the point of view, I'm not really sure which screen has been used, but I mean, in terms of what's missing from the screeners, we've talked about how the underlying ability is missing and how possibly the depending on which screen has been done. Oh, you're just saying it's the DST. So yeah, so from the DST, you haven't got any English attainment and you haven't got any underlying ability. The reason why it's quite difficult to argue is we talked earlier about the graduated response, and schools will argue with you that if your young person is making progress, that they don't need further assessment and they don't need a diagnosis. And you know, myself as a parent of a young person with dyslexia, he had his screen done in the middle of year 2, but actually we ended up paying for a private assessment in the middle of year 6, because actually until that point he didn't need the diagnosis. He was making progress and I was quite happy that his needs were being met. I think it's important that you have the diagnosis and you have further assessment if you feel that they're not fulfilling their potential, if they stop making progress, or if you feel it's impacting on their emotional and mental health and well-being, which quite often is a big indicator that it kind of needs looking into further. But in terms of what's missing from the DST, it's the underlying ability and the literacy attainment, and it's not standardized either, the DST, so you don't know how severe those things actually are. Does that help?
Yeah, the report said DST.
Hang on. Oh,
I can't see any more questions now.
There's something in the chat from Sam, Joe. Can you see it?
Yeah, recommended the next review. The report said DST1 high risk, lucid, rapid. DST recommended for the next review. Are they different? Yeah, probably. Actually, perhaps we can deal with that one slightly differently, sort of through emails or through a telephone conversation or something, if that's okay.
Can I ask you, Joe and Karen, one of the things that we hear all the time is that we won't do anything different if you have a diagnosis, if you get the report. We're doing everything we can. And this is one of the things I get across. The advantages of having the full diagnostic assessment is the targeted recommendations for intervention and support. Can you explain a little bit about what the interventions are like, what you get from a report that you wouldn't get just standardised or blanketed support? Yeah.
Do you want me to go, Joe?
Yeah, go, Karen.
Okay.
I'll chip in. I'll chip in.
Please do, please do. I think one of the most important things is the diagnosis. Once you've got it in print, it's there with you for life. So you're going to have the diagnosis, you're going to go further, it's there with you. You've got an understanding of where that individual is working, and the interventions will be different as to what that individual might need. It might be a reading intervention or a spelling intervention, or wherever it is they need to bring themselves up to where they ought to be for their age range. The other thing I would say is that it gives us an indication for exam access arrangements, which can be acted upon down the line. Now, from the age of 9, the JCQ, the Joint Council for Qualifications, will start to put access arrangements in for exams. And I think that's really important. You're not going to get that otherwise. You're not going to be able to put that in place without some kind of assessment that's given interventions. And we go back to that standard scoring and say, okay, so that person is working in a below average range. It gives us the ammunition, if you like, to say we can apply for things down the line, like exam access arrangements. And if that individual is moving through the education system and they've had an assessment from an early age, then we would use that in further education and say, okay, it opens up the door for educational healthcare plans. It opens up the door for a continuum of support, not just in the primary or the secondary years, but all the way through. And then we would look to do a top-up assessment, to do a post-16 report that can then be taken into university. So I think it is really important to start that as soon as possible. and start those interventions in place and see how that individual then starts to progress because intervention is put into place. So does that...
I think I always explain to parents that for me, a full diagnostic assessment and report, if done properly, I always say to parents, it's a bit like a roadmap of how that young person learns. It tells you exactly where their strengths are, exactly where their difficulties are, and it tells you exactly which interventions and what level to go in. Because quite often through the consultancy work that I do, I find schools are actually quite good at putting interventions in place, but they're not necessarily putting the right intervention in place.
Yeah.
Or going in at the right level for that young person. So what the assessment does is actually, it may look like not a lot changes actually, but you'll find that the tweaks that are made and perhaps the interventions that are put in place are much more specific and go in at the right level. So I hope that answers that one.
Yeah, that's great. And also just one last question, if you don't mind. Another thing that we hear a lot is that we won't assess until year whenever X9 because they'll have to be reassessed for access arrangements for GCSEs, and I know that that's obviously not correct. Can you just clarify what the rule is with diagnostic assessments and access arrangements?
Yeah. Do you want me to go, Jo, or do you want to go?
Yeah, no, you go.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier on about the age 9. JCQ will say really best practice is that they will start to put access arrangements in place once a person has hit age 9. Now, yeah, they might, but even if you are going to do an assessment and diagnose a person who's younger than that age, an assessor can still put recommendations in place to say, actually, because the scores are below average in certain areas, then we can start to build a picture as to where they may need access arrangements. But of course, it's not just about access arrangements, it's about that individual at that time now. And what we don't want them to do is to get further behind the schooling because they're not up to the same speed or the same level of attainment that they ought to be for their age group at that moment. And if we don't know that, if we wait until they're a few years older, just think about how further down the line they're going to be struggling. And it's the earliest intervention for me is the better one because it gives you the opportunity to help that person shine. And remember, it's not just about where they are in academic prowess, it's where they are in themselves.
Yeah.
We notice an awful lot about self-esteem, and I think we forget about that youngster that's crying every day, that's coming home, that's working really, really hard. Go back to that swan analogy that Jo mentioned before. Might look like they're doing brilliantly and they're breezing through, but underneath they're working so hard that actually that's taking all their energies. And if they're continually deflated, they're not going to have also a really good, positive schooling experience. So I think you've got to take the whole picture together, really.
Yeah, I will play devil's advocate just for a minute as a Senko, and schools will argue that if a young person is making progress, they won't pay for an assessment. The only time you will get school to pay for an assessment is if that young person is not making progress. And because funnily enough, I was sat in a meeting the other day arguing, but actually this young person is making progress, but they're not making progress in line with their ability.
Yeah.
So just playing devil's advocate there for a minute,
but then you
will have a battle on your... You
can argue as well, there's progress and then there's progress from targeted intervention.
Yeah.
And
that's what I'm not disagreeing.
Don't realise when you have the assessment, it's so specific to the individual. The interventions that they are given will accelerate progress rapidly. That's what you need, rapidly.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We were saying about assessments, having that assessment in place as they progress and they go to secondary. A lot of teachers will say, well, we'll wait, we'll assess them so they get access arrangements, but you don't need to have another assessment to get access arrangements. It's just repeating some of the tests to get the scores to see if they qualify.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There's another question from Rosemary. How long do you give interventions in school to make a difference, years or months? Well, part of the graduated response should be an intervention should go in place and it should be reviewed within 6 weeks. And if it's making a difference, it may well be that school decide to keep them on. If there's accelerated progress and the gap's closed, it may be that they come off of it. But in my experience as a SENCO and as a specialist and consultant, what happens is if you get quite an early diagnosis, you find kids will dip in and out of intervention the whole way through their schooling. And I mean, and that is the other thing to say, is I do feel for classroom teachers, because actually there is an element of discrete teaching that has to happen if you are dyslexic, that multi-sensory explicit teaching of spelling rules. A class teacher with the best will in the world cannot give a dyslexic person everything they need. Would you agree with that, Karen?
Definitely, yeah. And I think that's where we as specialist teachers come into our own as well, because we have the opportunity to work with an individual on a one-to-one basis outside of the school setting and give that individual the care and the attention that they need to work on their own skill set. And yeah, I agree with you. In schools, it's really difficult because they've got a bunch of young people with a variety of different learning needs, and it's very difficult to target those. But with dyslexic learners, they definitely need that targeted approach. They definitely need the individual one-to-one to build on their successes that they can achieve, but we need to kind of start to unlock the key, really, for that achievement.
I mean, if I go back to my son again, sorry to keep using my son, but I think it's just quite good to talk from experience, isn't it? You know, with him, he had one particular year where he had the most fantastic teacher who totally got him, and actually the classroom provision was fantastic for him, but with the best will in the world, she was never going to give him everything he needed. And we did actually seek some tuition as well, and the tuition coupled with that really good teacher saw him kind of really accelerate and take off. But you know, I've just acknowledged with poor old Bill that it's going to be something that we're going to have to constantly keep on top of, and he is going to have to keep dipping in and out of interventions because he isn't severe enough to be statemented or have an EHCP, but does need something extra. And I think it's about our expectation as that of parents as well, that we can't expect school to do all of that. There is an element that we do need to do ourselves as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame. We were saying about the reports. He's lucky, obviously, to have you as his mother, because you do have that understanding there. And one of my biggest wishes for people that work in education is that they do, when a parent is willing to go and get these private assessments done, that they look at the reports and actually take those recommendations on board, because finance is a huge issue at the moment. We've just found out that budget's being cut again. So I hope that educators do actually look at them and see it as an advantage. Yeah,
I mean, in my experience, the majority of schools, I mean, the majority of my work is actually private assessments. I go into very few schools and actually work for the school. But my experience is that actually SENCOs are just relieved when a report comes their way that a parent has paid for. They're like, hurrah, I know exactly what to do with this young person. And generally, they are really well received in schools, in my experience. And you know, and we had a question last week, we haven't had one this week, but we had a question last week about is it important to involve the school? And absolutely, you know, when a parent comes to me to commission a private assessment, I will always ask them if they're happy for me to contact the school, because I think it's good to have that relationship. But also, if you contact the school prior to it, ask what interventions they've got, ask what they can realistically deliver, and try and weave them into the recommendations a bit more. The reports are quite often much better received than when they don't know it's happening and it lands on their desk, and you know, actually they're trying really hard already. And so, you know, it's all good.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Rosemary said it's been 2 years, no reviews, and still significant issues in literacy.
So she needs an assessment. She needs a meeting with the SENCO to talk about what's going on.
Class teacher and SENCO, just to obviously the SENCO is a special education needs coordinator, but the overall responsibility for your child's progress is the teacher. So I would see if you can get them all together to talk about how they can move forwards.
Sam's question: when intervention is in place, what evidence would you expect to see if you involve where the provision is carried across the school rather than just in, for example, small group? it's going to really depend on the age of the child and on the school, because all schools have their own records. Some schools use provision map writers where they keep records of progress, but I can't really answer that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. I would just expect, when I had my 6 weekly review, and I would be expecting a 6 weekly review, I would be expecting them to show me some sort of data. So whether that be just, you know, they knew 5 sight words and now they know 15 sight words, or whether that be, you know, an increase in reading age, whether that be, you know, some sort of scoring confidence, some sort of data that shows that they've been improved. Been improved? Sorry, I can't talk anymore.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Smart targets.
Yeah, those.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, Sam, it should definitely be documented. So you should be able to see, there should be a map for your young person. You should be able to see exactly which interventions have been tried and how effective they've been. Because it may well be you try an intervention and it doesn't work, and actually that's okay.
But it's knowing that it's not been effective, reviewing and trying something else.
Yeah.
I should say as well, we do actually have a webinar coming up with one of our other assessors. We know her as Pixie, or Lindsay Scorer, but she's going to be doing a webinar with us on smarter targets, which I hope will go down quite well and might help answer some of your questions as well, Sam.
Okay.
What time is it?
10 o'clock.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Do you want to what does that say?
So I think if the school are trying nothing in secondary, then you need to arrange a meeting with the year head, probably secondary, and the Senko. And if that's unsuccessful, then I suggest you go to your local branch of SENDIAS
Or IPSI,
or IPSI, and get them to support you at a meeting to find out what's going on.
Okay, yes, bedtime. Lisa, are you great?
Bedtime.
It is bedtime. Thank you very much to Karen and Jo. It was a pleasure working with you both again. And thank you everybody that sat here with us for the last 2 hours. I hope you found it really, really useful. And we will see you again, hopefully at another webinar. Take care.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Bye. See you later. Bye.